give Professor Peter Cole another round of applause. I'm not going to speak as long as he did, but I want to do this very quickly. This is the extent of my PowerPoint presentation. On strike, shut it down. The longest strike at an institution of higher education in the United States of America took place during the height of the Vietnam War and revolutionary struggles all over the world. On strike, shut it down. We're celebrating what, the 51st year this year? Well, actually, this will be November 6th. This is another proud moment for me when I was in the ILWU, the Million Worker March. This is what most of the so-called progressive Democrats and the Democratic Socialists are talking about today. Slashing the military budget, a national living wage, hands-off Social Security, workers' rights to organize, tax relief for the working class, preservation and protecting of the environment, truth in media, amnesty for all undocumented workers, repeal corporate free trade agreements, stop offshoring of American jobs, stop corporate greed, repeal Taft-Hartley. That's what the Million Worker March was about in 2004. I was one of the organizers of that. That's my PowerPoint. I want to first acknowledge someone. Would Mr. Walter Riley please stand up, please? This is Brother Walter Riley. He was at San Francisco State during the strike. He then went on to become a very important civil rights attorney. And you may also know that one of his children is Boots Riley, who's sorry to bother you. Let me just do a little something here, folks, so that you can understand a little bit about me. Catherine talked about how I'm a third-generation longshore worker. And you've had a definition of what longshore workers do. My grandfather became a longshore worker in 1944 from Louisiana. My dad became a longshoreman in 1963. I became one in 1985. I've gone on to become an officer in ILWU Local 10, serving multiple terms as Secretary-Treasurer. I am retired now. I'm retired from the waterfront, but not from the struggle. I have led and been a part of the leadership of rank-and-file actions such as the Million Worker March that I just explained, calling for workers to break away from the Democrat and Republican parties and organize independently, mobilizing and organizing in our own name. In 2008, we shut down all 29 ports on the West Coast. The first time in American history that workers have gone out on strike not for high wages or benefits, but to oppose U.S. foreign policy. That foreign policy spoke specifically to the question of the war and occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan. 29 ports worldwide on International May Day, also during our contract negotiations. That was a real no-no. 2010, we shut down 5 Bay Area ports action for justice for Oscar Grant in jail for killer cops. First time in American history that any U.S. labor organization has withheld its labor around the question of police brutality and murder of the black community. On the anniversary of Dr. King's assassination in 2011, we shut down all Bay Area ports for 24 hours. As many of you know, Dr. King was assassinated while attempting to express solidarity for sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee. In 2014, there was a solidarity action for Palestine. It was called Block the Vote. Many of you may have heard about it. We had a contingent of community people that came down, some 5,000 people, marched to the Port of Oakland in response to the unwanted murder of innocent women and children. Someone had to stand up for that. And by the way, when you talk about solidarity, that's not an empty slogan. The Zim line, which is an Israeli shipping company, does not come to the Port of Oakland because of the many actions that we've taken in response to boycott, sanction, divestment. That means that we don't get jobs. But you want to know what? We learned from the old timers with regard to the boycott, sanction, divestment towards South Africa that we were in a position to take such action. And that action was replicated by trade unionists in South Africa and Sweden and other places around the world. The last thing I want to mention is that we've had shutdowns regarding the issue of support for Black Lives Matter and the minimum wage demanding $15 an hour. So this is a little bit about what I've been up to since I was a member of ILWU Local 10. I want to read something to you so you can kind of get some focus to understand why the strike at San Francisco State lasted for 5 months. You need to be very clear about something. That was a revolutionary action. And I'll explain to you why right now. Quote, one of the most effective confrontations in the history of the U.S. student movement, the San Francisco State College strike, will no doubt serve as a precedent for future campus disruption. The strike has been unique in many ways, differing completely from the events at Columbia University in 1968 or the recent disruptions at Cornell and Harvard. The San Francisco State strike witnessed the formation of new alliances, the use of new tactics, and the mobilization of unprecedented support. The effectiveness of the strike can be attributed primarily to the leadership of the San Francisco State College BSU, otherwise known as the Black Student Union. This is excerpted from Riot's Civil and Criminal Disorders hearing before the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations of the Committee on Government Operations, United States Senate, 91st Congress, First Session, Part 22, page 571. I know some of you might have thought that came out of Ramparts magazine or some left publication. It came out of United States government. This is an indication of how serious they took our action and why the action at San Francisco State was replicated at other campuses. You notice I didn't mention UC Berkeley because that hadn't happened yet. My rendezvous with destiny, as I like to define it, happened right here at San Francisco State. My first semester here in 1967. November 6, 1967, 1 year before the San Francisco State strike, the Gator incident. How many people in there know about the Gator incident? That's the reason why I'm here. Because you see, you don't know about your history at this institution. I'm going to get into that in more detail. First of all, how many of you, is the Gator still around? Is there still a Gator newspaper? How many of you in here read it? Okay. More people read it back then, but the things they had to say, a lot of it wasn't worth reading. But I want to give you some background as to why the strike took place. The Gator newspaper had an editor by the name of Jim Vasco, if I'm not mistaken. And he was perturbed by the growing popularity and activism of the Black Student Union here at San Francisco State. One of the things you may not know is that San Francisco State has, for many decades, been a commuter college. It's been a college where a lot of the students who attended were people that had been in the service, had families, gone back to school, and were very politically active. At San Francisco State, the Black Student Union and other organizations had been involved in experimental college. We had various programs here to make the college experience much more relevant to the community. For example, the Black Student Union brought in people like Amiri Baraka, who many of you may know. He was a world-renowned writer and poet, African-American. He was Leroy Jones at the time. He was brought here as a lecturer. That's one of the reasons why Danny Glover became a world-renowned actor, because Danny was a part of plays that Leroy Jones organized here. It was called Street Theater. We were getting funding to do these kinds of projects through corporate funding. One such source was the Carnegie Foundation. And Mr. Vasco took it upon himself to try to undermine the funding by petitioning those corporations not to give us any money. So a group of us students went to the Gator office to discuss the matter with him. And the only thing that I can tell you is that fisticuffs disrupted. We were summarily suspended by then Dr. John Summerskill, who was the president at that time. We were summarily dismissed without any due process, and the students were up in arms about it, not just black students, white students as well. So then there was a kangaroo court that was set up. 4 of us were suspended, 3 were dismissed, 2 were brought back on what they call probation. Suffice it to say, this was part of what was happening at State College 1 year before the 1968 strike started. I was eventually reinstated. Willie Brown represented us. He was then a up-and-coming assemblyman, and he is also an alumnus of San Francisco State, Hastings College of the Law as well. He felt the need to help young black men attempting to get an education. He teases Danny Glover and I right now. He says, I should have left you 2 in jail. I don't think he meant it, but you never know.
Oh, yes, he did. That's who he is.
I appreciate that, what Willie did for us, though. He kept us from going into penitentiary. We move on. Why was there a strike at San Francisco State? Let me be very clear about something. That strike wasn't about some abstract, self-centered idea of a group of radical black students. That strike was about making the San Francisco State College experience relevant to every student of color in the Bay Area. We're all taxpayers. And we believed that we needed to have an education that was going to prepare us for self-determination. Well, what does self-determination mean? That means the ability to determine our own destiny. That means if the black community wants to support the Palestinians, we don't have to worry about what the Democratic Party says. Our struggles are linked. It means that we can embrace socialistic programs in this country that most Americans don't even understand that are socialist. Public schools, Social Security, Medicare for all, 8-hour work days, pensions. Yeah, to be able to find your own destiny. Okay. Dr. Nathan Hare was brought to the campus. I was the Black Studies coordinator at that time. It was a great deal of student leadership in conjunction with connection with the community. Everything that we did was connected to something working class centered. We wanted to bring more students of color to the campus. We had an outstanding tutorial program that was preparing young people to matriculate through the system. But we wanted to make sure that when it was time for them to enroll, that they would have the same kind of benefit that the elites have. They call it legacy points. You know, like when George Bush sent his son to Yale, he didn't have the grades. But because George Bush's daddy had gone to Yale and was president of the United States, well, that meant something. He was, as a matter of fact, at that time, he was a congressman and the head of the CIA. The point of it is that we learned that 2% of all of the college admittees can come through the institution without meeting the regular requirements. Why did black people learn that? Because that's when we approach the administration and say, hey, we want some of those spots to go to black students so that we can make sure that this college is representative of the numbers of people of color in the Bay Area. That was the precursor to the Educational Opportunity Program, people. That's how EOP got started. Not because somebody at the state legislature liked the idea, quite the contrary. The Board of Trustees, I think they still run the operation. Maybe now it's all Board of Regents, but at the time you had this Board of Trustees for the state colleges, and you had the Board of Regents for the University of California system. These are radical notions. Radical notions. These are not reformist notions. I want to talk a little bit about why the strike was allowed to go on as long as it did. We were reading such books as, when I say we, I'm talking about the leadership of the Black Student Union. We were reading such books as The War of the Flea by Robert Taylor, who draws the analogy of guerrilla warfare, of a flea on a dog, and how a dog can't bite the flea, he can't claw it. That flea being us, the students, how we disrupted classes. Yes, we disrupted classes. Initially, the professors weren't going along with the strike. We disrupted classes. We had rallies. We brought community people onto campus. We did all sorts of things. We read books such as The Wretched of the Earth by Dr. Frantz Fanon, who was a man of color from Martinique, which was a colony of France, who was a psychiatrist, and who was in Algeria during the Algerian Revolution, who talks about the struggle of the colonized overcoming the colonizer. So we had a philosophy and an idea that drove us and kept us going. We read about Protracted Struggle by Mao Zedong, who described how they used guerrilla warfare against the Japanese before they were able to develop an army strong enough. If you remember, if you look at any of the archives, the progressive archives, about the San Francisco State strike, one of the first things that will strike you is the overwhelming presence of the San Francisco Tax Squad, a special elite, what I would call vicious. They had no blacks in that particular segment of the police department at that time. They committed, well, a lot of brutality took place. A lot of students who were, some of the students at that point weren't even involved in the strike, were attacked by them because they had orders from the governor. Yes. Ronald Reagan, that's where he got his start from. S.I. Hayakawa got his start as a U.S. Senator right here at San Francisco State as president. I want to move on and talk about the ILWU. and how it supported the strike and why it supported the strike. The faculty, the AFT of San Francisco State, petitioned the San Francisco Labor Council for strike sanction. Their position is that they wanted to have collective bargaining. They supported the strike. They wanted the removal of the tax squad from the campus, and they did not want any kind of reprisals taken against people who were on strike. ILWU Local 10 provided material support for the faculty and the students who were out on strike. How did they do that? They provided jobs. Casual jobs. Those are jobs that are extra jobs that longshoremen don't fill, were given to workers and to students that were part of the strike. When it came time for the negotiations to settle the strike, Mayor Alioto called upon one of the first African Americans to serve as an international vice president of the ILWU. His name was William Bill Chester. He was a part of the negotiating committee that was called upon to negotiate the settlement of the strike. In closing, let me say this. Today, before this gathering started, there were a group of black students on the yard that were calling attention to issues relative to black students on campus. And I thought to myself, did this happen because I'm here today? Is that a coincidence? Or is this an indication of how little things have changed? I'm going to close with this. The goal of the strike, other than those particular issues that I laid out about the Black Studies Department, the School of Ethnic Studies, Nathan Hare, it was about ending racism, gaining self-determination, and the seizure of power. Because one of the things that I learned as a 21-year-old is that we could organize, challenge the state, and we could win. And that has provided me with the foundation for all of the other things that I've done as a trade union and community activist. I'm going to end it now. Hopefully you have more time to ask questions. Thank you.